Hello and welcome back to A Shark's Perspective. Selfishly, one of my favorite parts of my own journey and career is speaking. Other than being a lot of fun in some aspects, serving an audience and community is such an honor to me. And speaking is an excellent way to make a significant income as well, as long as you're following a proper system. And it's easier said than done for many, but if you do this marathon right, then there really is no limit. Grant Baldwin is the CEO of the Speaker Lab, a speaker, podcast host, and the author of The Successful Speaker, 5 Steps for Booking Gigs, getting paid, and building your platform. And on this episode, we'll discuss inside tips to get gigs consistently, needing a book or an agency to be a speaker and get paid, how to measure your value, fixing problems, finding your niche, stand-up comics, demo reels, Nashville, Zig Ziglar, Gary Vee, and a lot more. So let's tune in to a successful speaker with a successful shark who speaks on this episode of A Shark's Perspective. Grant, thank you so much for joining us today on A Shark's Perspective. So if you could, tell us what your background and your career today, your speaking journey is so far.
Yeah, so the nutshell is I used to be a youth pastor. So I went to Bible college and then got a lot of opportunities to speak in that format and really enjoyed it. Parts of it, in terms of the role, parts of it I liked, parts of it I didn't like. But the thing I really enjoyed, the thing I really came back to and wanted to do more of was speaking. And so I felt like I was decent at it, wanted to do more of it, no idea what to do from there. So after that, I met a couple guys who are full-time speakers and just started trying to learn about the business and figure out how do you book gigs and who hires speakers and what do you speak on and how much you charge and just that whole world. And so for the next several years, just built up a career as a full-time speaker. So I was doing usually anywhere from 60 to 70 gigs a year all over primarily the U.S. and loved it. It was a lot of fun and got to a point where I had a lot of people who were asking me how to become a speaker, and some who were interested in doing it full time, and some who were interested in saying, "Hey, I'd love to do it just a couple times a year, but I don't know how to find gigs." And all those same questions I had when I got started. So we started doing some teaching and training around that, and that's what evolved into what we do today, which I run the company called the Speaker Lab, where we teach and train speakers how to find and book gigs. So so all the ins and outs of the speaking world is what we're a part of now.
So to get 60, 70 gigs a year, you were either overcame a deadly illness, you were a war hero, or a pro football star, right?
None of the above. I don't, and that's one of the things that we teach a lot with
exactly.
speakers is that people assume that you have to have these prerequisites in order to be able to book gigs. Like you mentioned, you have to, climb Mount Everest, or you have to overcome cancer, or you have this like crazy obstacle that you've overcome or story that you can share. And yeah, there's certainly like a place for those in the speaking marketplace, but that's not the case for most people. Like I'm a white dude that comes from the Midwest, like a normal middle class family. So there's nothing on paper that qualifies me to be a speaker in the traditional sense that a lot of people think of. But I think at the same time, that's also made the work that we do very relatable because people realize, okay, if that guy can do it, then and he has no special skills or special qualifications that people think that you need, then I can probably figure it out too. And so, yeah, you don't need those things in order to be a speaker.
So you have a new book, The Successful Speaker. What was the impetus for that? I've heard you talk about this a few times on your own shows, whether or not somebody needs a book to continue to be a speaker or not, or what was the impetus for writing the book, and where do you see it helping your own career?
Yeah, I had written when I was doing a lot of speaking. I was doing a lot of speaking in the education space, working a lot with high schools, colleges, parents, teachers, those in the education space, and so I actually self-published a book several years ago for students that did really well. I wrote every single word of it. So from like a bucket list perspective of like, all right, I wrote a book, check that box. I'm good. I don't necessarily enjoy writing. I enjoy speaking. I enjoy doing interviews, doing podcast stuff for our own show, for stuff like this. And it's that's kind of the medium I gravitate towards is audio and speaking versus writing. And so I know that, I see the value of a book, and I know how it could help in different ways. And so a couple years ago, had a friend who approached me about the possibility of doing a book for speakers. So we talked about what that could look like, kind of went back and forth on it, and that kind of evolved into what the project is today. So the book is The Successful Speaker, 5 Steps for Booking Gigs, Getting Paid, and Building Your Platform. And basically, we want to take everything that we've learned in the speaking business and consolidate it down into a book. And so for me, the point of the book is there will be people who may never listen to our podcast and who may never come across our site. and who are may stick to like a traditional form of media like a book, and so they're going to come across the book and find it in a bookstore, or order it online, or hear about it from this show or elsewhere, and who may never again come across our stuff, but this is a good way to introduce them to some of the other things that we do, and how we help speakers. So we have not held anything back in the book. We've tried to put everything we possibly could in there. So it is basically a handbook and a guide for speakers at any level to be able to book gigs. So yeah, really, really excited about the book.
Well, so if you had to take a guess, why do you think we're seeing such a jump in the field of speaking, if you will? You're inspired now to write a book. You see a lot of podcasts on this. I mean, speaking obviously has been around forever, but I think maybe some of it's the bubble I'm in my own life with speaking at a lot of conferences. It just seems like 99% of the LinkedIn photos I see today as well have somebody with a microphone in their hand on a stage, and everybody is just jumping into wanting to be a speaker. Maybe not everybody, but there's a lot of people who want to be speakers because they've got something to say.
Yeah, I mean, in this day and age, like people still recognize speakers as being authorities and being experts and having a certain level of recognition and prestige. So that's why people use a lot of those pictures, is because there is it's like the same thing if if you meet someone for the first time and ask what they do, and they say I'm a brain surgeon, or
Yeah.
I'm a rocket scientist, or there's a certain level of like, oh wow, that's legit. So someone saying like, oh, I'm a speaker, like, oh wow, that's good, that has a certain amount of cachet that comes along with that, so to speak. So I think there's certainly that part of it, and then I think for a lot of people who are interested in speaking, like speaking is also, for many people it can be terrifying, and for a lot of people though, in addition to the terrifying, it's fun. It's a fun way to help an audience. It's a fun way to connect with people. It's a fun way. There's something unique and special about being on stage in front of an audience and sharing an idea or a thought or a concept or a principle, and seeing like those light bulb moments of helping people get it and be able to apply it to their business or to their life. So yeah, there's certainly something special about being a speaker.
Well, question before we dive into some of the mechanics: who is your favorite speaker of all time that you've seen?
Great question. So there's a lot of speakers I've seen, and they all are different in different ways. So John Acuff is a phenomenal speaker, and a good friend. Years ago, I saw Colin Powell speak, and he was the former Secretary of Defense or Secretary of State, something like that, and I saw him speak at something. He's very serious, right?
Yeah.
But a few things that he said were hilarious and really, really, like really well crafted. What I really enjoy is I really like comedians, because I think comedians are great storytellers. I think they're great speakers. They do something very similar to what we do as speakers in just a different context. Stand on stage for an hour or whatever, and deliver some type of presentation, and their job is the same: is to keep an audience engaged and to take them on some type of journey. So there's a lot of comedians I watch and resonate with, but yeah, Acuff is definitely one of the better speakers I've seen. Very funny, very polished, takes the craft very, very seriously, and does a great job from stage.
Did you ever see Ziegler?
I did actually. In fact,
I don't remember how many years ago it's been since I've seen him.
Yeah.
It was 20 years ago. He's probably been dead.
Yeah,
for
so
10.
it was when I saw him. His health was definitely in rough shape, and his memory was fading. So his daughter was on stage with him, and even though so for example, like one thing I remember is that he would speak, and like start to say a line or a story or something, and then a few minutes later he'd start the same thing over and say the same line or the same story. And so his daughter was there to kind of like steer him back on course and direct.
Sure.
But he played it off really well. He was kind of in a stadium type setting where it was in the round, and so he immediately was telling his daughter, well, like I got to tell this side of the room because they didn't hear me the first time, and he
right,
a zig line, that you're like, it was great. So it was cool nonetheless to see him.
Yeah, he's one of the best speakers I've ever seen. Well, I tell people all the time, I've done it a few times on this podcast, I'm clearly admit that I was a failed stand-up comic 100 years ago in my youth, but I have such a great respect for people who are able to deliver those kind of stories and still make people laugh. A couple times I got laughed, but it would depend on how many drinks they had, how watered down the whiskey was for that kind of bar. But
doing stand-up comedy, especially like in an open mic type setting, is brutal.
Yeah.
Very, very difficult.
Yeah, there's very few times as a speaker you get heckled but every
Yeah.
time you're a comedian, you do for the
Yeah.
right how late it is. So a lot of my own focus in marketing, especially, has been on fixing problems, and that's a lot of what I talk about. I know you talk about that a lot with narrowing down. So walk us through how someone should go about that as a speaker. How do they narrow down a particular problem to solve?
Yeah. So one of the most important things that any speaker can do in terms of just the early steps of getting started is what we teach back basically in the book is the speak framework. SPEAK makes the acronym, and so S is select a problem to solve. So get really really clear on who you speak to and what's the problem that you solve for that specific audience. So I think for a lot of people, we just enjoy speaking. We want to do more speaking, but we want to speak to as many people as possible on any type of topic, right? So if we were to ask you, who do you speak to? Well, I speak to humans. I speak to people. I speak to everyone. And if I were to ask you, what do you speak on? And people say, well, what do you want me to speak on? I can speak on anything. I can speak on leadership or change or customer service or faith or marriage or like all these different topics. I'm like, it's no different than any other restaurant where like if you try to speak on all those things or if you try to solve all those problems, you're going to be mediocre at best at all of them. So one of the things that you've probably heard us say is that we want speakers to be the steakhouse and not the buffet. Be the
Mm-hmm.
steakhouse and not the buffet. And what we mean by that is that you don't try to be all things to all people. So Ken, if you and I were going to go to lunch and we were looking for a really good steak, we have an option. Like we could go to a buffet where steak is one of 100 different things that they offer. They're all the items on that buffet are mediocre at best. Or we could go to a steakhouse where that's all they do. Like they don't do tacos, they don't do lasagna, they don't do pizza, they don't do any of these other things. They do one thing and they're the best at it, right? And so that's what you want to be positioned as a speaker. Say, I solved this one specific problem for this one specific audience. And as counterintuitive as it seems, the more clear you are on that, the more specific you are, actually the easier it is to actually book gigs versus I'm trying to appeal to anybody and everybody, right? So it's kind of like, if being a generalist versus a specialist. A specialist is actually easier to book gigs versus a generalist who like, yeah, I guess I could speak on something like that. Like that's not really reassuring for a potential event planner or decision maker who is considering hiring you as a speaker. So the first thing you have to do is, again, get really, really clear and really focused on what that problem is that you're solving. And remember that you are in the problem solving business, right? So it's more than just, I overcame cancer. And so I want to tell people about that. Okay. The honest truth is that nobody cares. Nobody cares. Like that's great that you conquered cancer. That's great that you overcame that obstacle. That's great that you survived the whatever. But people want to know, how does that apply to me? That's great that happened to you, but I want to know what's in it for me. So always think through that and remember that as a speaker, you are in the problem solving business. So if your presentation, your talk doesn't help that audience solve a specific problem, then you're definitely not going to get hired.
Well, then, do you think the pullback from a lot of speakers is they're just too afraid of being labeled with one specific problem? Because I know a lot of people in a lot of senior roles, for example, they may have had experience in 5 different things and they don't want to,
Totally.
I'm just making up a number, they don't want to go down strictly one because they're afraid they're going to get stuck in that one
Yep.
forever.
Yep. No, absolutely. And again, let's go back to the restaurant analogy. It's no different there that a lot of chefs could cook a lot of different cuisines. And so they're probably nervous, like, but I can cook more than steak.
Yeah.
I do a really mean lasagna, and I'm really good with tacos. And if you take the steak and you put it, I can turn it into a burger and I can do all these different variations, right? And so it's no different there. And so again, we think that the more things that we try to offer,
Mhm.
the more opportunities that we'll have. And the reality is the opposite is true. The more specific, the more narrow, the more clear, the more focused we are, the easier it is to find those opportunities. Because like, Ken, if we were talking a little bit earlier, that you live in Memphis, I live in the Nashville area, and so if you came to town and you're like, man, I'm looking for some really good tacos. What do you got? I'm not gonna send you to a buffet. I'll
Yeah.
tell you a couple of my favorite taco places,
Right.
and they don't do anything else. So if you're looking for barbecue, if you're looking for hot chicken, or if you're looking for whatever else, like that's not what they do. But if you're looking for tacos, like these are the places that you need to go to. And again, it actually again makes it easier to find those, is because you're solving something for a specific person rather than trying to be everything for everyone.
Well, you have narrowed down where I'm going to go to lunch today, if that helps you.
That's good. That's good.
But I want that buffet Jello that comes with it. So
you need some of that pudding.
absolutely. So walk us through how you go about narrowing down an industry. I mean, I know you do a lot of motivational speaking, but
how do you narrow down that industry? I think most speakers, they're not giving the same motivational speech to a youth group and the metal fabricators of Northern Ohio. I mean, you probably
Yeah.
could, but that's also sort of a niche down view of where you start pointing your speech towards an industry.
Yeah. So within the industry, there are 7 primary industries that we talk about in the book. And so those are corporations, associations, government and military, nonprofits, faith-based and churches, education, which is like K through 12, and then colleges and universities. Now, within that, there's a lot of subsets of potential audiences that you could speak to. What you don't want to do is say, I speak to corporations, but I also speak to churches, but I also speak to elementary schools, right? That's where it becomes a very watered down and you're trying to do all things for all people. That doesn't work. So again, being very clear on here's a very specific audience that I speak to. Now, how do you figure out what that audience is? A lot of it can come from your own background. Like what's the world that you came from? What's the world that you already know that you understand? So for example, for me, as a former youth pastor, I got my start speaking to, I was already working with students. So it was a natural transition for me to continue speaking to students in a different context, right? Versus saying, I want to go speak to CEOs. I'm like, I at the time wasn't a CEO, never been, I didn't have that experience. There's a guy in one of our programs I was working with recently, and he was trying to figure out who he should be speaking to. He was later in his career, and I said, let's talk about your experience. What have you been doing? He's like, I've been a realtor for 30 years, and I've been the president of the Colorado Realtors Association or something like that. I was like, let's start there.
Exactly.
Like that's a world you already know.
Right, right.
The challenge again for a lot of speakers though is we think like whatever you choose in terms of an audience or a problem that you're going to solve, we feel like it's a permanent decision, and it's not. It's a starting point, right? So so when I got my start speaking to students, that's where I started, and then over time, then I started speaking to a little bit to parents and teachers, and then I started speaking to more corporations and association, and then it's like it kind of evolved over time. Versus I'm going to pick this one audience and this one topic, and that's the only thing I can do forever and ever and ever. Like that I don't necessarily think is accurate or fair. Now, some speakers certainly do that. Some speakers find their audience, they find their problem, and that's what they stick with forever. So know that you can evolve, that you can change over time, but don't try to do all things for all people from the beginning.
So you also just talked about something that spurred another interest. It's the audience. Help explain, if you will, what types of events. If someone's trying to get paid to speak, they may think they're going to get some big paycheck from massiveconference.com versus a trade association, which actually pays the bills.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean there are a lot of opportunities that exist for speakers. So I think oftentimes, like to your point there, Kenneth, we think like, okay, I'm going to look for big national conferences or big national corporations or these big national associations and these types of events. The reality is that a lot of them, if they do pay speakers, they may have a massive budget and they're not looking for, let's say, an up and coming speaker.
Yeah.
So where
they're paying 2 or 3 keynotes, and that's it.
Yeah, and they may be paying, each of those, $30,000, $50,000, $100,000. They're not paying that for a brand new up and coming speaker. Now, at the same time, where a kind of a more up and coming speaker fits in is there are a lot of local, state, regional level events, conferences, trade shows that are looking for a speaker, and they don't have $100,000 budget to work with. They have $2,000 or $3,000 or $5,000, right? And now that doesn't mean like, man, all we have is $2,000, so we just know that we're going to get a crappy speaker. Like that's not the case. There are plenty of really high quality, $2,000, $3,000, $5,000 speakers, and so there's a lot of opportunities that exist there in the marketplace for those type of speakers who provide a great value for an event. They are not, a $10,000, $30,000 speaker, but they are a solid speaker who can still do a great job at a lower fee. So there's absolutely a lot of those in any type of industry that exist.
So there are a lot of people who are just trying to get their names out there. They're startups, like you were just talking about. There are a lot of people that are entrepreneurs behind startups that want to get out there and speak. How do you actually start figuring out if you have a topic that somebody is willing to pay a fee to have you speak?
Yeah, great question. So there's definitely an overlap there between what you want to speak about, what you're passionate about, what you're interested, and what organizations and groups are actually hiring speakers to talk about. Just because you're passionate about it, just because you care about it, just because you think everyone else should care about it, just because you think the world should know about this topic, doesn't mean that organizations or groups are actually hiring speakers to talk about it. So there has to be that overlap there. So a couple things that you can do, just some practical exercises, is one, you can look for other speakers who are doing something similar to what you want to do, right? So just do a quick Google search. If you said, I want to talk, I want to speak about uh, how to do like underwater basket weaving. Okay, that's great. Let's do a quick Google search, see if we can find some other speakers who are doing it. If you can't find any, that should be a red flag. Like the lights on your dashboard should be going off. Don't think or don't assume that, oh, nobody's doing this, I'm going to be the first. There is typically a reason why no one is doing that.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to look for speakers that are already doing it, because if you see like, hey, I can find several other speakers that are doing this, that's awesome. It generally proves that there is a market for that there are other speakers that are already doing this, and this is a topic that organizations and groups are used to hiring speakers to talk about. So that's one thing to do. Another thing is that you could look for the type of events that would hire you. So let's go back to the underwater basket weaving for a second. Go on Google and just do a search for Underwater Basket Weaving Association, Underwater Basket Weaving Conference, Underwater Basket Weaving Group, and you're starting to look for, are there any like natural gatherings around this topic that you could potentially speak to their audience. Another thing you could do is you could go to speaker bureaus' websites. Speaker bureaus have thousands of speakers listed sometimes, and a lot of them you can browse and you can sort by different topic categories. And so what you may do is you may just go there, and they may have a list of 50 different topics there that you could browse through the types of speakers there. And so you can kind of sort through and figure out which category would your topic naturally fit in. If you're like, I can't find one, I'm going to create my own category. Again, like that's not a good idea, and I wouldn't recommend that. So you're looking for, again, for some natural things where your topic would fit in to just show that there is a market that exists for this.
So I've heard you ask several famous speakers this. I'm curious on your personal opinion. Are you pro speaker bureaus or anti speaker bureaus? Or maybe not anti, but are you less of a proponent of it than some people?
Yeah, I'm a very much less of a proponent. I'm a fan of bureaus. Bureaus are fine. I think they. What I don't like about bureaus, and this isn't a bureau problem, I think this is an industry issue, that for a lot of newer speakers who are kind of up and coming, their perception is, I just, how do I get in with a bureau? If I just get in with a bureau, then man, I'm set, And I get it. Like I had the same perception when I got started of just like, if I just get in with a bureau, if I can just find an agency, if I can just find someone who's going to book me or represent me, I'm good. I'm off to the races. And it just doesn't work like that. Like if you can't book gigs yourself, a bureau is not going to be interested in booking you. It's not like sometimes we get confused on supply and demand when it comes to a bureau. So it's not like a bureau has like, wow, we have all of these extra gigs lying around.
Exactly.
And we don't have any speakers.
Yeah.
If only we had speakers.
Yeah.
Like it just does not work like that. So realize, again, I know from my own personal experience, I've done hundreds and hundreds of paid speaking gigs, and I'd say probably less than 10, maybe 15 of those have come from bureaus. And so if I get a bureau gig, if a bureau called me today and said, hey, are you available on this day? That's awesome. That's great. But I'm not banking on it, and I'm not building my business on it. So the same thing is true for you. Like you can't just sit back and hope that a bureau is going to take care of things for you. So that's the thing I don't like. Again, that's not necessarily a bureau fault there. I think that's just kind of like a way a lot of outside people like would perceive bureaus to be. So in addition, like just because you get listed on a bureau site doesn't mean anything. Like I'm listed on a whole bunch of bureau sites that never book me for anything, and it's fine. So if you think of like in fact, here in Nashville, there's a major speakers bureau here locally, and I've become good friends with several of the agents there, with the president there, and they've told me like, hey, we have probably 1,000 speakers on our roster, 1,000 speakers on our website, and they probably like consistently book less than 100 of those, right? And so, because again, think about it like a menu at a restaurant. A menu can have 1,000 things on there, but they're probably really only selling about 20 of those things, 20, 30, 50. Like they're not going to be selling all 1,000 equally. And because the other thing to remember is that bureaus make their money based on a percentage of what a speaker earns. And so if they have the option to sell a $20,000 speaker or sell a $5,000 speaker, they're going to make significantly more on the $20,000 speaker because they're going to get a percentage of that versus a $5,000 speaker. So just realize, like, again, bureaus are fine. They have done, I don't know that they've necessarily done anything wrong to perpetuate this.
Sure.
But the misconception for a lot of speakers that, man, if I just get with a bureau, like I'm set. I'm like, it just doesn't work like that.
Well, any other mistakes that you can think of that new speakers make when getting started?
I think going back to what we talked on earlier, that they just try to speak to anyone and everyone
Yeah.
instead of being really, really clear and really focused. That's the biggest thing that I see, is that we just think like but there's so many things I could speak on, and there's so many topics that I'm interested in. There's so many audiences that I have experience with, and like you can make a case for that all day long. But the reality is like that just doesn't work. And then you can think of also like there's several examples. Of people who started with one very small niche thing and expanded from there. So, for example, let's take someone like a Gary Vee. Okay, Gary Vaynerchuk is a very well-known, expert and business personality and speaker and author. And Gary today speaks on a variety of different topics. But Gary got his start in social media and business talking about one very specific topic that he was passionate about. You know what it is? You remember?
The Jets.
Jets was part of it.
Wine?
Wine.
Yeah.
Wine.
The family
right?
wine business, yeah.
Yeah, so he's passionate. Like, I'm talking about wine. That's it. That's all I'm going to do. Now I'm starting to gain a little traction. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about social media.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to talk a little bit about branding.
Now he's an expert on LinkedIn.
Yeah, now he can do a bunch of different things,
Right,
but he starts with wine. I'll give you another example. Take the example of Nike. When Nike got their start, and if people haven't read it, go read Shoe Dog by Phil Knight, the founder of Nike. It's a very fascinating story. The number of times that Nike was on the brink of disaster is absurd. It's just crazy. But Nike got their, like today, Nike sells all types of sporting goods and apparel and everything under the sun. Nike puts their logo on. But they got their start selling a very specific running shoe for a very specific type of runner, like collegiate runner. Not for all runners, not for basketball players, not for baseball players, not for football, not for just an everyday walking shoe. They sold one very specific shoe for one very specific type of athlete. And then from there, then it expanded a little bit more over time to what it is today. But they didn't say from the beginning, like, okay, we're going to sell everything for everyone. We're going to do basketballs and baseballs and golf and shirts and shoes and hats. We're going to do everything. Like, no, we're going to sell shoes for this very specific type of college runner. Like that's a very specific, and then we're going to expand over time. So you can expand over time, but again, you have to start narrow, you have to start focus and expand from there.
Riches are in the niches. So what's the biggest mistake you made as a speaker?
Good question. I think the other thing that I think is not necessarily a mistake, but I think for any speaker is just to have like a long-term perspective on the business. Like sometimes I think speakers assume, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to be a speaker, and Friday afternoon I decide to be a speaker. And on Monday, I'm like, why don't I have a gig yet?
Yeah.
And it takes time. So it took me a couple years to go from 0 gigs to being able to do it full time. And it's true again with any type of business. Like it just requires work. It requires effort and discipline to stick with it. So if you're just kind of like, I'm just kind of like speaking's kind of cool. I think I'd be interested in doing that. Like you're probably not going to make it. But if you're like, no, like I love this. I'm passionate about it. I'm going to do this. I'm going to figure out how to do it. Then you can absolutely do it. It just requires work. It requires effort.
Well, and then the previous guest has been on your show. She's been on mine as well, Melanie Diesel. We had this conversation about, people that really work on the craft. You can tell the difference. There are a lot of people who just run up on stage, and then there are actually people who it's a profession. It's not just a side hustle.
100%. Yeah. So if you, and that's one of the nice things about speaking is there's not necessarily like a right or wrong way to do it.
Yeah.
Meaning that you, both in the business model, but also in the presentation, meaning that, there's nothing that says you have to do 50 gigs a year or 100 gigs a year in order to be a professional speaker. For you, you may decide like, I don't have the bandwidth to do, that many. I'd love to do 5 or 10. And I'm just trying to figure out how to get those 5 or 10. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And the same way from like the presentation standpoint, there's nothing that says like you have to do an intro and then 3 points and then a conclusion. Like that's a model a lot of people use, but you don't have to do it that way, So there's a lot of ways to go about doing it. There's not necessarily like a right or wrong way that everyone has to do it this way.
So you do videos on YouTube critiquing other speakers and how they present. First of all, I'd like that you'd swear on this podcast to never critique one of mine because I'm a hot mess on stage. I warn everybody that I have ADD when I get up there so that they get their phones ready in case somebody else squirrel and I fall off the stage. But what are some of the tips or tactics that you help people become better speakers?
Yeah, I think a couple things speakers can do. One of the best things you can do that we don't really get into on a video, or it's hard to see sometimes, is the preparation and the work that you don't see.
Yeah.
And so and you kind of touched on this and alluded to it, but the best speakers on the planet, they don't just get up and like, I'm going to write a couple thoughts down on a napkin and then just
Yeah.
kind of wing it and see what happens. Like, it just doesn't work like that. And the same thing is true with comedians. Like, you understand
Yeah.
this, that there's so much work that goes on behind the scenes for them to practice and think through and rehearse and write down their notes and try material and craft sentences and words. And I'm going to use this word instead of that word for a very specific reason. And there's just a lot that goes into it. And so a lot of speakers deal with, with nerves and anxiety and feel like, oh man, the audience is going to eat me alive here. And this is so scary and terrifying. So a couple thoughts to that. One would be that the audience is on your side. Like, we've all seen speakers, and I want nothing more than for the speaker to be good. I don't want you to suck. I don't want you to be bad, because if I'm going to sit there and listen to it, I want it to be interesting. I want it to be fascinating, entertaining, engaging. So we want you to be good. And the best way that you can be good is to practice and do the work
Mhm.
that nobody sees. The other thing I would say for speakers is to use stories. Stories are extremely memorable. They're very, like, if I said right now, all right, Kenneth, I want to tell you a quick story. Like, immediately you're probably drawn in. You have no idea where the story is going. Is this going to be funny? Is this going to be sad? Is this going to be boring? Is this going to be sappy, interesting, inspirational, motivational, depressed? I have no idea where the story is going, but I love stories. And that's just true. That's a natural human reaction, is that humans love stories. So I think for a lot of speakers, the best thing you can do is use more stories in your presentation.
I always warn people so that they don't get nervous and scared is network with 2 or 3 people prior to their presentation, so that when they get locked, they get up on stage, they can kind of have a familiar face that they've had a pleasant conversation with, and that helps
Yeah.
deflate a lot of it, because I think people look at 100 people in an audience and just freak out. But if you find 3 that are friendlies, it makes a lot of that transition better.
To your point there, in terms of like interacting with an audience ahead of time, like I do that a lot.
Yeah.
Standing at a door as people are coming into a session, or going around, just kind of like even giving a high five or a fist bump or shaking hands or any of that stuff. Because one, it familiarizes you with the audience, but it also familiarizes them
Oh,
with the audience.
absolutely.
So it's the difference between like sitting in an audience and seeing someone on stage and you're like, I don't know who this person is,
Exactly.
and hopefully they're a good speaker, versus like, I met this person beforehand, I talked to them for 30 seconds, they seem nice, I'm going to be a little bit more in tune with what they're talking about, I'm going to be a little bit more engaged. So yeah, that kind of like warming up the audience in terms
Yeah.
of like the one-on-one interactions you have before you speak can definitely help with some of that confidence on stage.
It'll likely get you better reviews as well. I think the other thing that I was
Sure.
going to talk about too is you do need to watch yourself on video, as painful as it is. I always, I do, and I just cringe at watching it because I can look like I'm all over the place. But the other is, I think that it's hard for a lot of people who are tactic driven in their presentations to understand how to wrap around telling a story with tactics. So if you're,
Yeah.
for example, if you're talking about tactics for growth, it's sometimes very hard for speakers to wrap up that kind of conversation. So a lot of people will be, more entertained by better stories, but are they necessarily going to learn when they're hearing other types of speakers give tactic presentations? And that's always been a little bit of a difficult transition for people.
Yeah, and stories are also like, when it comes to like tactics and strategies, you can talk about like case studies and examples of like,
Yeah.
here's such and such, or a company that implemented this, and here's the results that they saw, or here's how they implemented this, or here's this theoretical idea, but here's how this look in the trenches of how this would actually play out. You can share all those stories. The other thing too is that if you'll notice, stories are very memorable. So
Mhm.
if you get up in front of an audience and say, I'm going to give you here the 10 best tactics and strategies for accomplishing XYZ in your marketing, like, most people aren't going to remember those 10. They're not going to remember 2 of them, right?
Right.
But if you share a story,
Right.
like, those stories are what they're going to remember days, weeks, months later. So I notice this all the time. My wife and I, we have 3 daughters, and my oldest daughter goes to our church's youth group. And there's a lot of times I'll go pick her up from youth group. She just came out of church. She just left youth group. I just picked her up, and I asked her, what did the youth pastor talk about? And she's like, I think he talked about this or that. Oh, let me tell you the story he told. And she can tell the story spot on.
Mhm.
And I'm like, you just heard him. So I think, again, like, it's so true for so many, again, audience members, yourself and I included, that like, I can think of, I can't remember all the points. I can't remember all the the tactical and the trenches stuff that they were talking about, but I remember a story, I remember an example, I remember a case study, I remember those things, but it also helps me to then connect the dots. Oh yeah, that helps me to remember what they were talking
Well,
about.
and you talked about this on a previous episode I listened to not that long ago about Seth Godin, who's brilliant at taking whatever it is and wrapping a story around it. He does an amazing job at that. So, what marketing assets then, other than starting with reaching out to the Speaker Lab, of course, but what marketing assets do people need to have in place when they start down that path of a speaking career? Is it website, demo reel, day one? Where do you start to get them on that path?
Yeah, those are the two big ones that you really need, a website and a video. Because if you don't, like in this day and age, like if you don't have a website, you don't exist. It's hard for people to take you seriously. You definitely need to have a website. One of the unique things about being a speaker is that you are the product, you are the brand, right? So it's not like you're selling some type of third-party widget or tool or gadget or gizmo. Like people are buying you. So because of that, I actually recommend that you use your name as the domain. So for me, like if someone's interested in hiring Grant as a speaker, I send them to grantbaldwin.com, and that's where they're going to find the information about my speaking. So I recommend you definitely got to have a website. Second thing that you got to have is you got to have a demo video. So think of a demo video like a movie trailer. Before most people would go see a movie, they want to see a trailer. They don't need to see the whole thing. They don't even want to read a synopsis. I need to see the trailer because that they take a 90-minute movie, they boil it down to 2 or 3 minutes, and you have a good idea of what's it about, who's in it, what's the plot, what's the theme, all that stuff. That just gives you enough to figure out if this is something you're interested in. The point of a movie trailer, the point of a demo video is to make people want to see more. Make people want to see more. And so that's exactly what you're trying to do with the demo video. Is for a potential client who watches it is like, wow, that was really good. I need to learn more about this speaker. This is what we are looking for. That speaker was interesting, or they're funny, or they're engaging, or their story was passionate. Whatever, like that's what you need to show, and people need to see that rather than you just describing yourself. Well, I'm a nice speaker. I'm a good guy. I'm a funny speaker. I'm an engaging speaker. Like you can use all the adjectives you want to describe yourself, but people still want to see you speak to determine if you're a fit for their event. So those are definitely the two marketing tools, the two marketing assets that you need is a website and a demo video.
Do you ever run into you personally, because you've got a successful podcast about speaking? Do you run into a problem much where people know you as the Speaker Lab a lot more than you trying to point them to a Grant Baldwin domain?
Yeah, so we have two different sites, and
Yeah.
basically depending on what people are looking for. So if someone says, "Hey, I want to hire Grant as a speaker," then we send them to grantbaldwin.com. Whereas if someone says, "I'm interested in becoming a speaker," which is much more the case where people are familiar with us, is we send people to the Speaker Lab, and that's very intentional. Like in fact, when we first started creating some resources and tools for speakers, it was kind of all under the Grant Baldwin name or brand, and I wanted to get away from that.
Mm-hmm.
There's pros and cons with having a business under a personal brand. I wanted the Speaker Lab to be more than just Grant, and I know that a lot of people are familiar with us because of me, because of my story. I know that I'm the voice on the podcast or the face on the videos or for webinars. So I recognize like I'm the face of a lot of what we do. We have a great team behind the scenes that helps do a lot of the training and coaching with speakers as well. And so it's more than just me. So yeah, I think it's important for any entrepreneur to really think through, building a personal brand versus building something that's not dependent on their personal brand.
So there are a ton of experts out there who are speaking at conferences. I've known a lot of them that for years have been speaking just to get their name out there. They've spoken for free. But is it a bad thing for people to speak for free? And if they are speaking for free, what should they expect or / demand from that?
Yeah, there's definitely a misconception about speaking for free, that speaking for free is like always a negative thing or it's always a bad thing. What I would say is that speaking for free is okay as long as you know why you're doing it. As long as there's a reason, a valid reason that makes sense for you. No, so what I'm saying is I just love speaking. I just want to speak for free all the time. Like that's a great way to run out a business, in the same way that
Mm-hmm.
if you run a bakery and like, I love baking cupcakes and I just want to give everyone my cupcakes. Like it doesn't take long before you can't afford to make any more cupcakes and give them away. So you're providing value in the form of a speech. You need to make sure that you are compensated with value. Now that value may or may not always come in the form of a check. So I give you some examples of when it might make sense to speak for free. So, for example, one of the best ways to get better as a speaker is that you speak, that you practice, right? So, there may be some opportunities for you early on where you're like, I just need to get better. I just need to get on stage. I need to get some reps in. And so, I'm looking for just some free things that I could speak at. Now, typically, that's going to be something more local, more regional, something that's not going to require massive amounts of time or travel time or expense for you. I'm a lot more likely to do something like that There's a couple of friends conferences I've spoke at locally that are 20 minutes away versus, hey, can you fly halfway across the country and be gone for a couple of days to speak for free? Probably not likely interested in doing something like that. So just the opportunity to speak is a win. Another opportunity where maybe it makes sense to speak for free is if you have some type of product or service that you offer on the back end, whether that's a book or coaching or consulting. I'll give an example. There's a client that we worked with, and he speaks for free, but has a life coaching business that he offers on the back end. His life coaching business does over $300,000 in revenue, but the whole thing is built upon speaking for free. So on paper, you look at it, you're like, oh man, you do all these gigs for free. That doesn't make sense. You're losing money. It's like, actually, the whole business, this multiple six-figure business, is built on speaking for free. Selling books or offering some type of, again, coaching um, or a training or course or whatever it may be, just some type of lead gen for other things that you offer may make sense for you with speaking. And in many cases, you can actually make more from lead gen for other parts of the business than you could for whatever that an event might actually pay you. Another reason may be if you're wanting to attend a conference anyway. So if there's some type of, like, especially in the marketing space, there's several conferences that may not pay speakers, but by being a speaker, you're able to kind of rub shoulders and network and connect with other speakers who may be there. There's also a certain level of, like we talked about earlier, like recognition and prestige that may go along with being a speaker at that event. So all that to say, there's a lot of reasons that may make sense for you to speak for free. And I don't like necessarily the black and white approach of, oh, if you speak for free, you're not a real speaker, or it doesn't count, or you're not a professional. Like, there's a lot of reasons to speak for free. But again, you just need to make sure you're doing it. You're receiving some type of value in turn, and in exchange for the value that you're bringing to the table.
Well, and there's an SEO value if you play it right, and there's a video
Sure.
value if they record it. That a lot of people, that way you don't have to pay for somebody to do videography. But I know another that a lot of people, and I think I may have had this same conversation with Melanie about, is you got to remember that conferences are not in the business of promoting you. So figure out what it is you can take advantage of if you're going to speak for them to help build their brand. You've got to get something out of it to help build yours, to go to the next level. But I heard another guy that you had on your show, Josh Linkner, who I think is fairly well known, but he was great about being transparent about his own, his own business. And he's not necessarily what you think of as a household name, but he talks about innovation, and he charges like something like 35 grand a keynote. And he spoke 160 plus times a year, had a $4+ million speaking business. How does somebody start going? Now, granted, not everybody's going to go to a $4 million speaking business or a $300,000 life coach business, but how does somebody transition from, I'm sure you get a lot of people who've gotten their feet wet with speaking for free, and now they need to figure out how to make that a sustainable, lifestyle and career where they can get paid and pay for the bills. How did they go from that transition? How do you sort of position them to do that?
Yeah, so one thing to recognize and realize is, again, someone like Josh or other examples who are, $20, $30, $40,000 keynote speakers. Again, that's not an overnight transition,
No.
So ultimately, part of what you're thinking through is figuring out how much you should be charging as a speaker. I'm speaking for free. I'm doing a few free things here and there. Now, how much do I charge? And there's a couple of variables and factors that may go into that. One is going to be your industry and market. You can charge more in some industries versus others. You can charge more speaking to corporations than you can to nonprofits. You can charge more speaking to colleges than you could to elementary schools. It doesn't necessarily mean, and I do not recommend, that you say, okay, which industry charges the most? Which one can I make the most?
Right.
I'm just going to go after that. Like, that doesn't work. So industry is definitely going to be a factor. Your experience level is going to be a factor as well. Josh did not start charging $35,000 the first day he started speaking, right? He's done hundreds, probably thousands of presentations at this point, to the point that he is very, very good. He's extremely polished whenever he gets on stage. So recognize that as well, that your experience, if you're a brand new speaker, you typically won't be able to charge as much as someone who's been doing this for several years. And then the third piece is going to be your marketing materials. When an event is considering hiring a speaker, oftentimes they're looking at multiple speakers, and so your material needs to look on par with other speakers at your level. So if you're charging, let's say, $10,000 as a speaker, your website, your demo video, your marketing materials, they need to look on par with other $10,000 speakers. Because whether we like it or not, like, people still judge books by their cover.
It's packaging.
So so if people look at your website, your video, and it's just like, it just doesn't look good, people are going to assume like you're not a good speaker. May not be true, may not be fair, may not be accurate, but that's what people assume. So again, you want to make sure that your stuff looks quality, it looks polished, it looks it represents you well. And so then also, like we talked about earlier, is just kind of the long-term perspective on it, of knowing like, okay, if I want to go from 0 gigs to 50 gigs, that starts by going from 0 to 1. And if I want to go from $0 to $20,000 as a keynote, that starts by charging something, right? And so that may be like my very first paid gig, they paid me $1,000. I've done several gigs that early in my career that were for $500, for a couple $100, maybe just for travel expenses. But all of that like built the momentum that led me to the point where I've been able to charge, thousands and thousands of dollars to speak. But that's not, again, an overnight thing. So have that long-term perspective there. And even when it comes to fees, like people ask a lot of times, like, hey, all right, what should I be charging in my situation? We actually have a free tool people can fiddle around with, which I don't know if have you fiddled with this at all? Have you seen this?
I started it, and then what I was going to ask you about was with that tool where somebody can figure out what their speaking fee is.
Yeah.
It's on the Speaker Lab, but it's a different website. What's the website?
Yeah. MySpeakerFee.com.
Correct.
MySpeakerFee.com.
That helps you figure out the basics of what your fee is. But how does that backstory, if you are a war hero or, overcome an illness or those other things that take you to go from, say, $2,500 a speech, I'm making up a number, to $3,500 or $5,000. How do you sort of figure out that back end piece for what it's worth?
Yeah. So basically the calculator, it's a totally free calculator. You go there, you answer like 6 or 7 quick questions. It takes you less than a minute about the event, how much speaking you've done, what's the industry, some of the different variables that may go into an event, and then it tells you a number of what you could potentially charge for that. Now, what I would say is it's much more of an art than a science. So
agreed.
There's no magic formula that if you're a war veteran, then you get to charge $1,000 more. Or if you've conquered cancer, you get to add 10% to your rate. Like there's nothing that allows for that, or that is calculated in that way. So definitely use it as a guide and not like as gospel as like the end all be all. So I think for some speakers, they're just like, I have zero clue to where to even begin. Where do I need to start? So I would start with that as just, again, a free tool there that they'll get you going and get you in the ballpark.
For people that want to be speakers, what's the biggest thing that you generally see that prevents them from becoming speakers? Is it, fear of being labeled as an imposter? Is it fear of being on stage? Is it lack of being able to make a decision? What are the things you see for people who think they want to make this transition but are not sure? And that may have just answered the question.
Yeah, I think for a lot of them, they just don't do the work. And so it's like, honestly, like I think it's very simply that, because one of the things we say all the time is that speaking and finding and booking gigs, a lot of what we teach is simple, but it's not easy. It's simple, but it's not easy. So it's kind of like, if you want to lose 10 pounds, right? What do you need to do? It's really simple. You need to pay attention to what you eat, and you need to exercise. I am no health expert, but I know those are the two things that you got to do, right? So pay attention to what you eat, exercise. Simple, but it is not easy. So the things that we can talk about in terms of how do you find and book gigs, it's simple, but it's not easy. And it comes down to actually doing the work. And so the speakers that I know that have been successful are those that have said, I'm not just kicking the tires on speaking. I'm not just kind of like vaguely interested in it. I did this once, and like, yeah, I wouldn't mind doing it a second time. It's like, no, I'm all in on this. I'm all in, meaning like, no, doesn't necessarily mean a certain number of gigs. Rather, like, I'm passionate about speaking. I want to make speaking part of my business. And again, this is true with anything. Like if you said, like, I'm going to be, the king or queen of LinkedIn. But I'm just going to I kind of log into LinkedIn from time to time, and I just kind of I'm put it in my bio, but that's about the extent of it. But I'm not in the weeds of this, then don't expect to be positioned in that way, and don't expect the same type of results. So everything that we are teaching about speaking is simple, but it's not necessarily easy.
Well, agreed. And you also have to have, other than just a passion for speaking, you have to have a passion for knowing that the people in the audience, they want to learn and be entertained. There's not a cattle call for people that come up and just want to hear you go half-ass it through a speech. I mean, it has to be, you have to have a healthy level of respect for the audience, for what they're going to get out of that as well. But Grant, you're in the Nash Vegas area, so in Middle Tennessee, unless you're seeing the San Jose Sharks face the Predators, you're not seeing a lot of sharks. But you're on a Sharks Perspective podcast, so I have to ask, what is your favorite kind of shark and why? And there's several different ones you can. I know you got 3 kids as well, so you're probably going to lean a little bit to baby shark as well. But what's your favorite kind of shark and why?
That's a unique question.
Yes.
Favorite kind of shark
I'm known for a
and
few unique
why?
questions.
Okay, that's all right. That's good. That's good. Keep me on my toes here. I guess. Okay. Well, here's one. Is this?
Anything's an
Uh,
acceptable answer. And
I
I'll tell
think.
you,
Well, I
I
think
just
a.
saw another one of my favorite sharks, not just the ones in the water, but Damon John speak at a conference not that
Okay.
long ago.
All right. There you go. I what I would like to do sometime is go swimming with like those whale sharks.
Oh, they're beautiful.
And
Yeah.
I've heard about this like it's in I think in Mexico or something like that. We've been to Mexico several times, and I think it's kind of a seasonal thing that you can just go swimming with these gentle giants. I think that'd be pretty legit.
Well,
So
you can
yeah,
go to the Atlanta Aquarium. It's not that far from you. They've got three, I think
just do that.
three,
Yeah.
and do it in a probably more enclosed environment. So, well, Grant, it's that special time in my show. Are you ready for the 5 most interesting and important questions you're going to be asked today?
Ready or not, fire away.
All right. Number one, if you had to choose one, confidence monitor with a timer or PowerPoint slides.
Confidence monitor with a timer for sure.
Could not agree more. I just had the experience where they had a confidence monitor without the timer, and the guy in the back that was doing the audio stood up. He held up two hands, which is the universal
Yeah.
symbol for 10 minutes.
Yep,
Turns
yep.
out he was talking to the guy next to him, and I didn't know that. And so I blazed through my slides thinking
Yep.
that I was in a hurry. And then I talked to him about it afterwards, and he was like, oh, sorry, I was just talking to the guy next to me. I'm like, come on. So number two, famous speaker question, Tony Robbins or Scott Stratton?
I'll go Scott Stratton.
Yeah.
Just because I've met him before and he's a great dude off
It's
stage.
a really good episode you have as well. So number three, again, a Nashville question, redneck royalty, since you live in the heart of country music, Garth Brooks or Keith Urban?
I'll go Garth because I've seen him in concert and he was very good.
I bet. Number four, lavalier or handheld mic?
I'm gonna go option C and go a Countryman, which is the over the ear.
Yeah.
Comes out in front of your face. So yeah, I'd prefer that. I'd go that option one, handheld option two, lavalier option three. The lavalier can be very hit and miss.
That's true.
And it's hard to control
What it bumps
there's several
into.
variables there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I prefer the Countryman that's on your face.
Mhm.
Option two would be the handheld.
Number five, and the most important question you're going to be asked today is biscuits or cornbread?
I'm gonna go. Oh boy, I'm gonna go cornbread.
This is the question that stumps people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
as long as there's a little sweetness to it, I'd go cornbread. But man, you can't go wrong with either of them.
No, you go to a Cracker Barrel in your part of the country or mine, then you can get both.
Life is good.
Yeah. So Grant, where can people find out more about you, follow your thoughts, grab a copy of the book, listen to the podcast, and more?
Yeah, everything that we do is over at thespeakerlab.com. The podcast is called The Speaker Lab. So wherever you're listening to this podcast, just do a quick search in your app there for that show, the Speaker Lab. The book is, again, The Successful Speaker. You can find all the information about it over at thespeakerlab.com/book. thespeakerlab.com/book. Depending on when you're listening to this, if you pre-order it, there's several different bonuses that go into it as well. So you can find out, again, all about that over at thespeakerlab.com/book.
Grant, thank you so much for being with us today on A Shark's Perspective. And in your own words, you're awesome.
Thanks, Ken. I appreciate it, buddy.
So there was my conversation with Grant Baldwin, the CEO of the Speaker Lab, a speaker, podcast host, and the author of The Successful Speaker, 5 Steps for Booking Gigs, Getting Paid, and Building Your Platform. Let's take a look at 3 key takeaways from my conversation with him. First, the business of speaking is great and the gates are open for those who want to speak. However, as fun as it is, it's tough too, and it's a long-term game. And there are a lot of people out there who have failed at this as a business. There's a lot to the sausage-making process in speaking. And I've learned so much over the years about this, it's given me a chance to really appreciate the knowledge that people like Grant are sharing. So if you're interested in this for an income, then check out his book. Speaking is awesome, but the speaking business is work as well. Make certain that you learn to balance the knowledge of that. Second, let's talk about storytelling. His point about comedians and speakers is spot on. I used to, like 100 years ago, do some stand-up, and as I learned more about the craft, I was always amazed at how much it opened my mind to better storytelling. A lot of people fail to incorporate enough stories in there. Depending on how much data and how much you speak about tactics, use stories when you can. Case studies are good as well to incorporate data. Better storytelling is a challenge for a lot of speakers, but there's a reason. The point is, it's just a half hour to an hour speech. You've got to give the audience something to wrap their brains around when you speak, and stories help do that. Third, One of my favorite areas of conversation on this show and on the others is about fixing problems. The need to do this is the same for a speaker as it is for a business. We need to focus that way. As he said, when you position yourself in your speaking business, don't try to be all things to all people. I've done this and will admit some guilt here too, but as I so often do on this show, I truly recommend you find your niche. The clearer and more specific that you are, the easier it is to book gigs, as opposed to only being a generalist. His recommendation is to really get clear and really focused. People want to know how your solution applies to them. He said, and I quote, "We think that the more things we have to offer, the more opportunities that we'll have. And the reality is the opposite is true." Great point. He reminded us of something that I've always wondered why people feared. You're not necessarily locked into any one topic. You can evolve into something else if you want. I speak on a variety of topics. The reason I say this is, even for an event planner to consider you, they often need a simple view of the problem you solve for them. Don't make it too complex. So if you want to hire me as a speaker, if you've got a question, then send me an email to kenneth@asharksperspective.com. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. As our guest said earlier, I'll challenge you to do the same. Go be the steakhouse and not the buffet. I'm a shark, so either it's good for me, even though I could honestly stand to eat a few more kale salads. So join us on the next episode of A Shark's Perspective.